Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Empty Cloud Monastery. My name is Bhante Suddhāso, and we'll be looking at another discourse from the Buddha this evening. So this is Anguttara Nikaya, Chapter 8, Sutta number 2. So I'll start with paying homage to the Buddha, and then I'll read through the discourse, give some explanations, and I'll take any questions at the end. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So, as mentioned, we're looking at Anguttara Nikaya, Chapter 8, Sutta number 2, which is entitled here Paññā Sutta, so the discourse on wisdom. So this discourse is presumably the Buddha speaking. And it begins, it says, monks, there are 8 causes and conditions that lead to acquiring the wisdom fundamental to the spiritual life and to its increase, growth, and full development once it has been acquired. What 8? And the first one he says, here monks, a monk lives relying on the teacher or a respectable spiritual companion. And one has a keen sense of conscience and prudence established regarding them with warmth and respect. He says this is the first cause, the first condition, which leads to acquiring the wisdom fundamental to the spiritual life and to its increased growth and full development. So this is the first one. The first one is living relying on the teacher. So normally in the suttas, when we see the teacher, which in Pali is satta, in translation it's often written with a capital T, because this is understood to be referring to the Buddha. So at the time of the Buddha, of course, you had the great fortune to be able to learn directly from the Buddha. But for those of us who don't have that option, then the second best, he says, is a respectable spiritual companion, which in Pali is garutaniya sabrahmachari. So garutaniya means, so garu means respect, taniya means a basis. So garutaniya means respectable, someone who is a basis for respect. And sabrahmachari means literally one who is also practicing the spiritual life. So sa means with, and brahma means holy or spiritual or divine, and chari means living or behaving. So brahmachari means someone who's living a spiritual life. Commonly, it's understood specifically to mean someone who's living a celibate spiritual life. So it's effectively synonymous with monastics. So sat brahmachari means your fellow monastics, your fellow spiritual practitioners. And so again, it should be understood that this is particularly talking about celibate monastics. So ideally, you have the Buddha as your teacher. Failing that, you have a respectable celibate monk as your teacher. And regarding that teacher, he says you should have a strong sense of conscience established. So in other words, you want to be very careful not to do anything offensive or harmful to them. So you want to be very cautious in your interactions with them, so you don't do anything inappropriate or immoral. And he also says that you should have warmth and respect for your teacher. So pema, which can also mean affection, and garava, which is related to garu, the word that I mentioned earlier, which means respect. So again, treating one's teacher with affection and respect. And he says this is a basis for gaining the wisdom which is fundamental to the spiritual life. So this already is pointing to the importance of having a good teacher in Buddhist practice. It's not easy to cultivate wisdom by oneself. So the Buddha here is already starting by pointing to the importance of having a good teacher who can help you in the cultivation of wisdom. Then the second basis for the arising of wisdom, the Buddha says, when a monk lives relying on the teacher or a respectable spiritual companion, and has a keen sense of conscience and prudence regarding them with warmth and respect. Then, from time to time, they go and ask them questions. For example, Bhante, why does it say this, and what does that mean? In Pali, it's erang katang, which means like, how is this, or what is this? And emasako atta, what is the meaning of this? So in other words, to periodically go and ask questions to your teacher. So that's one of the values of having teachers, is that you can ask them questions. And as the Buddha is pointing out here, this is a basis for the arising of wisdom. Not to just rely on your own opinions and ideas about things, but to periodically go to respectable monks and ask them questions. This doesn't necessarily mean that you need to believe everything they say, but rather it's constantly investigating and examining the Dhamma, and constantly also questioning our own interpretations of the Dhamma, and seeing if there might be other ways of understanding the Dhamma. And so it continues, he says, those venerables clarify what is unclear, reveal what is obscure, and dispel doubt regarding many doubtful matters. So this is the ideal scenario. You go to your respectable teacher, you ask some questions, and the teacher will help to clarify what is unclear to you. Maybe they might teach you something new, something you hadn't learned yet or which you weren't aware of, and they will dispel your doubt by helping to clear up whatever it is you have doubt about. And this, once again, is a basis of cultivating wisdom, the wisdom necessary for awakening. Then the third one, he says, after hearing that teaching, one practices withdrawal in two ways. So withdrawal or seclusion of two kinds, physical withdrawal and mental withdrawal, or physical seclusion and mental seclusion. So physical seclusion means actually taking the time to be alone or to be in quiet, peaceful places where you're not going to be distracted by other people. And mental seclusion means trying to isolate your mind from unwholesome thoughts and tendencies. So trying to cultivate what the Buddha calls mental seclusion means a mind which is free of greed, hatred, and delusion, even if just temporarily. Then the next one that he mentions, so he says, a monk is ethical, restrained in the monastic code, conducting themselves well with appropriate conduct, and seeing danger in even small faults. They keep the rules that they have undertaken, keep the training practices they've undertaken. So this next one, this fourth one, this is also quite important because it's emphasizing the value of morality and ethical conduct as a basis for the development of wisdom. So it says first one is silava, which means one has sila, one has morality, one has a commitment to following precepts of good moral conduct. Next, he says one is restrained according to the patimokkha. So this is particularly relevant for bhikkhus and bhikkhunis, those of us who have the patimokkha. So the patimokkha is the code of monastic conduct, which has been handed down over the centuries. And it's a useful guide to understanding how to examine our conduct in a wide variety of different situations. And he says, next he says, achara gochara sampanno. This means having appropriate conduct and domain. So achara means one's behavior, one's conduct, and gochara means your domain, where you go. The word gochara is interesting, and it literally means cow pasture or cow field. But it has the sense of like the field where the cows would wander. So then it came to be used to also be referred to humans. So the places that you normally go, the kind of places that you hang out in and spend time in. So he's saying we should be very careful in our conduct and also careful in where we go, what places we spend time in. Because elsewhere in the suttas, he explains a bit more what he means by this. So to be perfect in conduct and domain. So it means avoiding places which inflame our defilements or which tempt us beyond our current limits. So for example, if you are a recovering alcoholic, you don't go to the bar because that would be a dangerous temptation for you. So similarly, we want to be very careful about staying away from dangerous or tempting situations where we might be tempted to break our morality, break our code of conduct. And next he says, Anumotesu vajesu vayadasavi. This means seeing even small faults as dangerous. So in other words, it's not just like, well, I'm doing pretty good at not killing people, and I haven't tortured anyone recently, so I'm doing all right. But actually, we should also be looking, also, have I done anything slightly wrong lately? Well, I should try not to do that. I should try to always have good karma, good conduct at all times. So seeing even small acts of immoral behavior as dangerous. And he says, Samadaya sikati sikapadesu. So one trains oneself having undertaken precepts. So sikapada, training rules, guidelines to good conduct. So for the lay people, that's normally 5 precepts. Or when you're staying in monasteries or taking on monastic conduct, you would follow 8 precepts. And for those of us who are ordained monastics, it's a lot more. But whichever set of precepts you're following, then you make a sincere commitment to really practice with them, to train yourself using those training rules as a basis. And so he says this is the 4th cause and condition for the arising of wisdom. So again, morality as a basis for the arising of wisdom. It's very important. It's not to be skipped over. Then the next one, he says, Bahusuto hoti suttadaro sutta sannichyo. So this means one has learned a lot. One retains what one has learned. One stockpiles what one has learned. So one has a lot of knowledge about the Dhamma. And one remembers it, bears it in mind, and accumulates more and more knowledge of the Dhamma, knowledge of the suttas. So the word sannichaya means to stockpile, to make a hoard of something. So it's, I remember years ago I was talking to someone who said that he had only read the Satipatthana Sutta and he was never going to read any other suttas because you only need the Satipatthana Sutta. And it's like, well, no, the Buddha said you should stockpile suttas. You should make a hoard of them. You should pile them up in your mind. So you should really make an effort to accumulate knowledge of the Dhamma, not to settle with just a little bit, but try to make a giant stockpile in your mind. And he says, those teachings which are good in the beginning, good in the middle, and good in the end, meaningful and well phrased, describing a spiritual practice that's entirely full and pure. So this is a standard way of describing the Buddha Dhamma that we find in the suttas in many places. So good in the beginning, good in the middle, and good in the end. It's talking about how basically the moment we start practicing Dhamma, then our life starts improving. We experience more happiness, more peace, more clarity. And it keeps getting better. So through the middle, it keeps getting better, until we reach the conclusion, which is full awakening. So the highest happiness. And so he concludes, he says, they're very learned in such teachings, remembering them, reinforcing them by recitation. So that means chanting them. For example, in monasteries, we commonly chant excerpts from the suttas. It's also a common practice that people do on their own, reciting suttas, or these days, with the prevalence of books, also constantly rereading the suttas would fit in the same category. So reinforcing them by recitation or by rereading. Next, it says mentally scrutinizing them and comprehending them theoretically. Again, this means that we take the time to read the suttas, learn the suttas, memorize suttas, recite suttas, think about the suttas, and make an effort to understand the suttas, to understand what they're talking about. And the Buddha says this is the fifth basis for the arising of wisdom. So again, he's really emphasizing here the importance of learning the suttas, of not just resting content with just a little bit of Dhamma knowledge, but really making an effort to develop a thorough, wide-reaching, and deep understanding of the suttas, of the Buddha Dhamma that we are the heirs of these days. And the sixth cause, he says, they live with energy roused up for abandoning unwholesome qualities and embracing wholesome qualities. They're strong, staunchly vigorous, not slacking off when it comes to developing wholesome qualities. This is the sixth cause for the arising of wisdom. So here it means we're constantly practicing right effort. So the right effort to remove unwholesome tendencies of mind and to develop wholesome tendencies of mind. So at all times and all places. The seventh one, it says, when in the Sangha, they don't engage in motley talk. What an odd turn of phrase. Like useless or scattered talk. The Pali word is nana katiko. So nana means diverse or various or like all over the place. Random or disconnected or rambling or unnecessary talk. And what he translates as low talk is tirachana katika. So tirachana is the word for animal. So in a number of places in the suttas, the Buddha condemns practicing tirachana kata, which is commonly translated animal talk. And it means talking about just the random, useless crap that people normally talk about. So going on and on about current events and politics and actors and actresses and celebrities and the latest novels and movies and blah, 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 all that useless crap that people like to talk about. So the Buddha says, when in the Sangha, one does not engage in random talk or animal talk. He says, instead, either they talk about the Dhamma, or they invite someone else to talk about the Dhamma, or they maintain noble silence. So that's what we should be doing. When we're together, we should either talk about the Dhamma or maintain silence. That's it. So we don't talk about celebrities, we don't talk about novels, we don't talk about movies. We talk about the Dhamma or we keep silent. That's it. And here it also says, Tunhi bhavang nati manyati. So ati manyati means to look down upon or to think poorly of something. So it also means we shouldn't have a low opinion of silence. We shouldn't think that silence is despicable or undesirable, but rather we should appreciate it. We should enjoy the fact that it's better to maintain silence than to waste our time talking about random useless stuff, which stirs up the mind and cultivates foolishness and defilements rather than wisdom. Then the eighth cause for the arising of wisdom, the Buddha says, they observe rise and fall in the five khandhas subject to clinging, such as the body, such as the origin of the body, such as the ending of the body, such as feeling, such as the origin of feeling, such as the ending of feeling. And the same for perception, for mental activities, and for consciousness. So for the five khandhas, the five components of body and mind, we observe it as it is, so such as the body. We observe as the experience of that aspect is coming into being, so observing the arising of new body sensations, for example. And we observe the cessation or the disappearance of a currently occurring sensation or aspect of our body-mind. So noticing when something in our experience is changing. So this is happening every moment. Every moment, new experiences are arising and old experiences are disappearing. So observing that arising and disappearing is one way of describing the perception of impermanence. the recognition of anicca, the constantly changing nature of our experience. And the Buddha says this is the 8th cause for the arising of wisdom, which is the direct observation of impermanence. This is a basis for the arising of wisdom, first of all, because this is actually the nature of things. The nature of things is that they are, in fact, impermanent, constantly arising and ceasing. And through recognizing that, we can also progress towards relinquishing attachment to self-identity, making progress towards full awakening. Then from there, the Buddha goes on to talk a little bit about some of the positive side effects of practicing these 8 bases of wisdom. First one is, he says, their spiritual companions esteem them. This venerable lives relying on the teacher or respectable spiritual companion, and so on. So repeating the 8 bases for wisdom as prior mentioned. And he says, and the person thinks, clearly this venerable knows and sees. So again, the person, your fellow companions recognize the good things that you're doing to cultivate wisdom. So even if you're not yet a particularly wise practitioner, even if you're not yet anywhere near awakening, the people around you will recognize that you're committed to cultivating the causes and conditions of wisdom. And the Buddha says, this quality leads to fondness, respect, esteem, harmony, and unity. In other words, when we recognize each other's commitment to cultivating wisdom, then naturally we'll live together in a mutually supportive way. So again, this goes through all 8 of the qualities with one's fellow companions recognizing, oh, this person is making an effort to cultivate the bases of wisdom. Clearly they know and see. In other words, they're starting to understand the nature of reality. They're starting to see things as they really are. In other words, they're making progress towards awakening. And it concludes, these are the 8 causes and conditions that lead to acquiring the wisdom fundamental to the spiritual life and to its increased growth and full development. So that's the end of this discourse. So we can respect the sutta with 3 sadhus, and then I'll see if there's any questions. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Okay, and hello to the people joining in online. Hello to Rick, Gita, Lilani, Vivian, Mary, Julie, Jayanta, Maria, Mir, Marielle, Bhumika, Gold Days, Yankee, and Ronald, and everybody else who's watching. Good to see all of you. I don't see any questions online. Are there any questions from the residents here?
I have a question. So for the 3rd cause and condition, we're saying, so having heard the Dhamma, one practices seclusion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So like sometimes for the most part I understand that, but like sometimes I don't understand how like monks like kind of like share each other's thoughts or like
What do you
their
mean?
opinions on like learning on what they're learning from the suttas. Like for example, like earlier today, like we were reading all of us, and like we were kind of like sharing our perspectives of like our kind of like our own understanding of the sutta.
Mm.
So like how do monks do that, and is that necessary?
So yeah, spending time in Dhamma discussion is definitely useful. You just don't do it all the time. So spending a fair amount of time alone is extremely supportive to the development, in particular, of one's meditation practice. But also giving one the time to introspect, to really look at one's own mind and to contemplate the Dhamma in one's experience without the distraction of interacting with others. So there's a lot that goes into maintaining social constructs. So when we're with other people, we're constantly, there's the constant consideration of how what we're doing is interpreted and perceived by others. When you're alone, you don't need to do any of that. So it frees up a lot of mental space when you're alone. You don't need to have any consideration for what other people are thinking about what you're saying or what you're doing. Your only consideration is, am I acting in accordance with Dhamma? So that frees up the mind to focus entirely on Dhamma. But yeah, definitely time spent doing Dhamma discussion is extremely important, because it does, as I was mentioning earlier, it helps us to get a different viewpoint on things, to see if there's another way of relating to things, if maybe we misunderstood something, or maybe sometimes other people might learn something from us. Maybe we say something that they're not used to, and it gets them thinking differently. So yeah, definitely Dhamma discussion is an element of also of monastic life. We don't spend all our time alone, in case that wasn't clear by now. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Good. Okay, so we'll go ahead and, there's a question here. Bhavani says, how should be the mental conditions for developing wisdom? I think that's exactly what the whole sutta is about. So I don't understand what exactly you're asking. So maybe Bhavani, if you could clarify what you're asking, because this is exactly what the Buddha explains here. And Rick says, could you briefly repeat the list of 8? Rick, you should just read the sutta. I have the link to the sutta. Just read through it over and over again. There's also Bhikkhu Bodhi's translation, as well as Bhante Suddhāso's translation on Sutta Central. So you can read through all of them and you'll see all of them. It says, does the cultivation of all 8 together create an increased result more than practicing each alone? Yeah, absolutely. Practice all 8. Not just one. So all 8 of them are mutually supportive. And Gold Days, your question is a bit off topic, but it's short, so I'll give a short answer. It says, there are many versions of Dhammapada books. Recommendations for a Dhammapada book? Yes, read it in Pali. There's no substitute for reading it in Pali. None of the existing translations are good. Literally none of them. 0. There are 0 good translations of the Dhammapada available. If you want to understand it, you need to learn Pali and read it in Pali, because as yet, there is no good English translation available. Do you have a question related to the sutta?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
When it says that you speak of the Dhamma or you stay silent, but it means that you speak only about the teaching of the Buddha, but if there's anything outside the teaching of the Buddha that can relate to the Dhamma, you can talk about it or no?
Yeah, so if something is relevant to the Dhamma, so if there's, for example, drawing examples to current events or something that's going on in ordinary life, that's actually useful because it helps people to get a better understanding of the Dhamma. So that would still fit under talking about Dhamma. So it doesn't mean that we should only ever just literally read suttas out. But we should also give explanation, and sometimes in the course of explanation, then we reference other things. So the Buddha himself, for example, would commonly reference things like farming, or military tactics, or laundry, or metalsmithing, like ordinary things, because that was a way that people could better understand what he was trying to say. So it's totally fine to do that, as long as we don't get sidetracked. For example, the Buddha using military tactics to help describe practicing Dhamma, and then we're like, and I read this great fantasy novel, and it had these really cool combat scenes, and blah, blah, blah. And then before long, you're not talking about Dhamma, you're just talking about books and fantasy stories and novels, and then you're just wasting time. But if instead you're using something as a way of helping to illustrate or understand the Dhamma, then that's okay. You just have to make sure you don't get distracted into talking about useless things. Okay? Okay, and it looks like that's it for this evening. So we'll wrap up the session with 3 more sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And we'll see you all next time.